My name is Herbert Walsh, and I'm 76 years old, sitting here in my Richmond home, holding a photograph of my beloved wife Dorothy on our wedding day, trying to process the devastating discovery that while I was drowning in grief after a brain death, my own children secretly signed organ donation papers and sold her body parts for profit, leaving me to find out at the funeral home that the woman I had planned to bury whole and intact according to our religious beliefs had been dismembered and harvested like she was nothing more than spare parts. For 53 years, Dorothy and I shared everything, including our deep faith that taught us the body is sacred and should be treated with dignity in death. But my children saw dollar signs where I saw the vessel of my wife's beautiful soul. I'd love to know where you're listening from today, so please share your location in the comments below. And if this story moves you, I hope you'll consider subscribing, because what happened to me shows how even our most sacred beliefs can be violated by family members who put money above respect for dead and the grieving. Let me start by telling you about Dorothy, the woman whose memory was desecrated by our own children's greed, so you can understand why learning about the fate of her body felt like losing her all over again. Dorothy Mae Sullivan became Dorothy Walsh when we married in 1970, a beautiful 22-year-old with auburn hair and green eyes who shared my deep Catholic faith and my belief that marriage was a sacred covenant that would last until death and beyond. We built our life together around our shared values of faith, family, and treating every human being with dignity and respect. Dorothy worked as a school secretary while I spent 40 years as a supervisor at the Virginia Department of Transportation, and together we raised 4 children in a modest but loving home where Sunday Mass was never optional and treating others with kindness was the most important lesson we could teach. Dorothy was the spiritual anchor of our family, the one who made sure we said grace before every meal, attended church every Sunday, and lived according to the principles that our faith taught us about compassion, forgiveness, and the sanctity of human life and death. She volunteered at the church, organized food drives for the poor, and was known throughout our parish as someone who embodied Christian charity in everything she did. Our children, Robert, Patricia, Michael, and Susan, were raised in this environment of faith and service, and Dorothy made sure they understood that money and material possessions were far less important than character, integrity, and treating people with respect and dignity. She taught them that every person was created in God's image and deserved to be treated as sacred, especially in moments of vulnerability and death. Dorothy and I often talked about death and our beliefs about what should happen to our bodies when we died. As devout Catholics, we believe strongly that the body was a temple of the soul and should be treated with reverence and respect even after death. We wanted to be buried whole and intact, allowing our bodies to return to the earth as God intended without being violated or dismembered. We had made our wishes clear to our children many times throughout the years, explaining that we did not want to be organ donors or have our bodies used for medical purposes, because our faith taught us that the body should remain whole in death. We respected other people's choices to donate organs, but for us, this was a matter of religious conviction that we expected our family to honor. Dorothy and I had even discussed these beliefs with our parish priest, Father Martinez, who confirmed that our understanding of Catholic teaching was correct and that we had every right to expect our bodies to be treated according to our religious convictions. We had made our wishes known in our wills and had trusted our children to respect our beliefs when the time came. But apparently, our children had very different ideas about what should happen to our bodies when we died, ideas that were influenced more by financial considerations than by respect for our religious beliefs and final wishes. The crisis began in January 2023, when Dorothy suffered a massive stroke that left her in a coma at Richmond General Hospital. The doctors explained that the stroke had caused severe brain damage and that Dorothy was being kept alive by machines, with virtually no chance of recovery or meaningful consciousness. As Dorothy's condition deteriorated over several days, the doctors began discussing the possibility of brain death and the decisions that would need to be made about continuing life support. These conversations were devastating for me, as I struggled to accept that the woman I had loved for over 50 years was never going to wake up and speak to me again. Our children rallied around during this crisis, taking turns staying at the hospital, coordinating with medical staff, and providing emotional support as we faced the reality that Dorothy was dying. I was grateful for their presence and their help in making difficult decisions during the worst period of my life. When the doctors finally declared Dorothy brain dead, I was overwhelmed with grief and barely able to function. The thought of authorizing the removal of life support felt like I was killing my wife, even though I understood that she was already gone and that the machines were only maintaining the appearance of life. Robert, as the eldest child, took charge of coordinating with the hospital staff and handling the practical details that needed attention while I was consumed with grief. He assured me that he would take care of everything and that I should focus on saying goodbye to Dorothy and beginning the process of accepting her death. I spent Dorothy's final hours holding her hand, praying, and telling her how much I loved her and how grateful I was for our life together. When the machines were finally turned off, I felt like half of my soul had been torn away, leaving me hollow and broken in ways I had never experienced before. In the immediate aftermath of Dorothy's death, I was barely functional, unable to focus on practical matters or make coherent decisions about funeral arrangements and the many details that death requires. I was grateful that our children seemed willing to handle these responsibilities while I grieved. Robert coordinated with the hospital about releasing Dorothy's body to the funeral home, while Patricia began making arrangements for the funeral mass and burial. Michael handled notifications to extended family and friends, and Susan took care of the flowers and reception planning. I felt blessed to have children who could step in during my time of crisis. But what I didn't know was that while I was saying my final goodbyes to Dorothy, my children were meeting with hospital administrators and organ procurement coordinators about the possibility of harvesting Dorothy's organs for transplantation and medical research. Robert had inquired about the financial compensation available for organ donation, and the hospital staff had explained that while families couldn't be directly paid for organ donations, there were various fees and reimbursements that could offset funeral expenses and provide some financial benefit to the family. My children saw this as an opportunity to reduce the costs associated with Dorothy's funeral and burial, while also generating some additional income from what they viewed as her death. They were thinking about money at a time when I was focused entirely on grief and spiritual concerns. Without consulting me or informing me of their intentions, Robert signed the necessary paperwork to authorize the harvesting of Dorothy's organs and tissues. He forged my signature on several documents and told the hospital staff that he had legal authority to make these decisions on behalf of the family. The organ procurement process began immediately after Dorothy was declared brain dead, with surgical teams working to remove her heart, liver, kidneys, corneas, and other tissues that could be used for transplantation or medical research. Dorothy's body was systematically dismantled while I was in a chapel praying for her soul. My children had arranged for the funeral home to receive Dorothy's body after the organ harvesting was complete, and they instructed the funeral director to prepare her for burial without informing me about the extensive surgical procedures that had been performed on her remains. When I met with the funeral director to discuss the arrangements for Dorothy's viewing and burial, I was focused on making sure that everything reflected her dignity and our shared faith. I wanted her to look peaceful and beautiful, as if she were simply sleeping, so that our family and friends could say their final goodbyes with comfort and closure. But the funeral director, Mr. James Peterson, seemed uncomfortable and evasive when I talked about the viewing arrangements. He suggested that perhaps a closed casket service would be more appropriate, given Dorothy's condition, but he was vague about what he meant by her condition. When I insisted that I wanted an open casket service, so that people could see Dorothy one last time, Mr. Peterson became more direct about the challenges he was facing. He explained that Dorothy's body had been significantly altered during the organ donation process, and that restoration would be difficult and expensive. I was confused by his comments because I had no knowledge of any organ donation and had never authorized such procedures. When I asked him to explain what he meant, Mr. Peterson realized that I was unaware of what had happened to Dorothy's body after her death. The revelation that Dorothy had been subjected to organ harvesting was devastating and shocking. Mr. Peterson showed me the paperwork that Robert had signed, authorizing the removal of multiple organs and tissues from Dorothy's body. The documents indicated that her heart, liver, kidneys, corneas, and other parts had been harvested for transplantation. I couldn't believe that my own children had made such a momentous decision without consulting me, especially knowing how strongly Dorothy and I felt about keeping our bodies intact after death. The violation of our religious beliefs and final wishes felt like a betrayal of everything we had taught our children about respect and dignity. When I confronted Robert about the organ donation, his response was defensive and focused on practical benefits rather than the spiritual and emotional significance of what had been done. He explained that the organ donations would help save other people's lives and that the financial compensation would help offset the cost of Dorothy's funeral. Robert seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset about the organ harvesting, and he argued that he had made a responsible decision that balanced practical concerns with the opportunity to help others. He claimed that Dorothy would have wanted her death to benefit other people, even if she had expressed different wishes during her lifetime. When I tried to explain our religious objections to organ donation and the importance of keeping Dorothy's body whole for burial, Robert dismissed these concerns as outdated superstitions that shouldn't override the practical benefits of organ donation. He seemed to have no understanding of the spiritual significance of what had been done. Patricia, Michael, and Susan supported Robert's decision and expressed frustration with my reaction to what they considered a generous and helpful action. They argued that I was being selfish and unreasonable to object to procedures that could save other people's lives. But none of my children seemed to understand that this wasn't about opposing organ donation in general, but about respecting Dorothy's specific wishes and our shared religious beliefs about the sanctity of the body and death. They had violated our most deeply held convictions without consultation or consent. The viewing and funeral became a nightmare as I struggled to say goodbye to Dorothy while knowing that her body had been dismembered and reassembled by mortuary staff. The woman lying in the casket looked like Dorothy, but I knew that essential parts of her were missing, that she had been reduced to spare parts for strangers. During the funeral mass, I found it difficult to focus on the prayers and rituals that should have provided comfort because I was haunted by images of what had been done to Dorothy's body. The sacred ceremony felt violated by the knowledge that my wife had been harvested like a commodity rather than respected as a human being. The burial was equally troubling, as I placed flowers on a casket that I knew contained only part of the woman I had loved for over 50 years. The thought that Dorothy's heart, liver, and other organs were in different people's bodies, while her incomplete remains were being lowered into ground, was deeply disturbing and spiritually devastating. In the weeks following Dorothy's funeral, I struggled with depression and spiritual crisis as I tried to reconcile what had happened with my faith and my understanding of life and death. I felt like Dorothy had been violated and that our children had shown complete disrespect for our beliefs and values. I also discovered that my children had received significant financial compensation for Dorothy's organ donations, money that they had not shared with me or used for funeral expenses as they had claimed. The organ procurement organization had paid fees for processing and transportation that totaled several $1,000s. The knowledge that my children had profited financially from violating Dorothy's body and our religious convictions was almost unbearable. They had treated her death as a business opportunity rather than as a sacred moment that required reverence and respect. I began to question everything I had believed about my children's character and values. How could people I had raised to respect human dignity and religious conviction become so callous and mercenary when faced with the death of their own mother? The relationship between my children and me deteriorated rapidly as I confronted them about their actions and demanded that they acknowledge the harm they had caused. But instead of showing remorse, they became defensive and accused me of being unreasonable and ungrateful. My children seemed to genuinely believe that they had done the right thing and that I was wrong to object to their decisions. They argued that organ donation was a noble and generous act that should be celebrated rather than criticized, and they refused to acknowledge the religious and personal dimensions of what they had done. The conflict escalated when I consulted with Father Martinez about the spiritual implications of what had happened to Dorothy. Father Martinez confirmed that my children's actions had violated Catholic teaching about the dignity of the human body, and that the organ harvesting had been performed without proper consent. Father Martinez offered to meet with my children to explain the religious significance of their actions and to help them understand why what they had done was wrong from a Catholic perspective. But when I suggested this meeting, my children refused to participate and accused me of trying to manipulate them with religious guilt. The breakdown in my relationship with my children was complete and devastating. Not only had I lost Dorothy, but I had also lost my children, who seemed to have become strangers with values completely opposed to everything Dorothy and I had tried to teach them. I spent months in isolation and despair, cut off from my children, and struggling to find meaning in life that felt empty and violated. The grief over Dorothy's death was complicated by anger over what had been done to her body and by the loss of my relationship with my children. But something unexpected happened 6 months after Dorothy's death that would begin to restore my faith in human decency and provide hope for healing. I received a letter from Dr. Maria Santos, a transplant surgeon who had received Dorothy's heart for one of her patients. Dr. Santos had learned about the circumstances surrounding Dorothy's organ donation and was troubled by the lack of informed consent and the violation of the family's religious beliefs. She had never encountered a situation where organ harvesting had been performed against the wishes of the deceased and their spouse. Dr. Santos explained that ethical organ donation required clear consent from the donor or their legally authorized representative, and that religious and cultural beliefs about bodily integrity should always be respected. She believed that what had happened to Dorothy represented a serious breach of medical ethics. More importantly, Dr. Santos told me that the recipient of Dorothy's heart was a young mother named Lisa Chun, who had been dying of heart failure and whose life had been saved by the transplantation. Lisa wanted to meet me and to honor Dorothy's memory in a way that acknowledged both the gift of life and the circumstances of the donation. Lisa Chun turned out to be a remarkable woman who understood the complexity of my situation and the spiritual pain that Dorothy's organ harvesting had caused me. She expressed gratitude for the gift of life, while also acknowledging that the donation had been obtained through deception and without proper respect for our beliefs. Lisa proposed creating a memorial to Dorothy that would honor her life and values, while also celebrating the lives that had been saved through her organ donations. She wanted to establish a foundation that would promote ethical organ donation practices and ensure that families' religious beliefs were always respected. Working with Lisa and Dr. Santos on the Dorothy Walsh Memorial Foundation gave me a sense of purpose and healing that I had not experienced since Dorothy's death. While I could never approve of how the organ donation had been obtained, I could find meaning in ensuring that other families would not experience the same violation and deception. The foundation has worked to establish stronger ethical guidelines for organ procurement, better protection for families' religious beliefs, and improved communication between medical staff and families facing end-of-life decisions. Dorothy's story has helped prevent other families from experiencing similar violations. Most significantly, my work with the foundation has helped me rebuild my relationship with my children, who have gradually come to understand the harm their actions caused and the importance of respecting religious convictions even when they disagree with them. Robert, Patricia, Michael, and Susan have all expressed regret for their actions and have worked to make amends by supporting the foundation and advocating for better protection of families' rights in medical decision-making. While our relationship may never fully recover, we have found common ground in honoring Dorothy's memory. Today, more than a year after Dorothy's death, I continue to grieve her loss, but have found peace in knowing that her story has helped protect other families from similar violations. While I still believe that what was done to her body was wrong, I have found comfort in the lives that were saved and the positive changes that resulted. The experience taught me that even the most devastating betrayals can lead to positive outcomes when we channel our pain into efforts to help others. Dorothy's legacy lives on not just in the hearts that beat with her heart, but in the protections that now exist to ensure that other families' beliefs are respected. That's my story. How my children sold my wife's organs without my consent and violated our deepest religious beliefs, but how her memory became a force for protecting other families from similar exploitation. Sometimes our worst experiences can become the foundation for positive change that honors the values we hold most dear.